So to repeat, on June 11th, at your local bookstore or on Amazon, you can get this book, Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition and American Complacency. If you forget the title, I have a few postcards here you can take with you. The reason why I said what I said was not a statement about Colorado Springs, it's a statement about our country, that we're a very, very deeply polarized country. And whenever you start talking about American politics, which to a degree that goes far beyond any other book I've written, this new book does address, you feel it. And you feel it in the audience, you just feel it in the air. And it's not only the United States, it's democracies around the world that are being polarized and ripped apart by identity divisions, by what social media is doing to our face-to-face relations of trust and cooperation, by what Russia is doing to manipulate and cynically widen and inflame these divisions, not only in the United States, but throughout Europe and many of the countries on the periphery of Russia, and just the world we're in now. It's very sobering. And this is one of the challenges I address in this book, Ill Winds. I want to just give you I'm not going to talk about the United States much, simply for reasons of time. If you have questions, I'll be glad to answer them. But I do want to begin by saying that I think we're in a deepening slump, at least, a decade-long recession of democracy in the world. And I think that what is new about this slump in the last 5-6 years is that it increasingly involves the decline and decay of democracy in the United States and in other advanced industrial democracies that have been at the core of the international liberal order, mainly our Western European allies. And if we don't figure out a way to improve, revive, strengthen, and reform our own democracy, it's going to be hard to address the international challenges I'm going to share with you. I'm going to also say two other preliminary things. Number one, I am very sensitive to the problem of marginalization. I think this is a problem in our democracy now, and in somewhat different ways that many Western European democracies are dealing with. I think the world has been struggling with, democracy in the world has been struggling with 6 key trends that together compose the deepening democratic recession that we've been in for about a dozen years now. The first one is declining levels of freedom and democracy. The second is a general deterioration of the rule of law in the world, with a surge in corruption and growing executive abuse of power. The third, and related to that, is the wave of illiberal populism that's been sweeping countries like Hungary, Turkey, now Poland, Brazil. I'm deeply worried about the Philippines. The fourth is what I was alluding to, that democracies around the world, and now the distinction we used to make between the advanced, stable, liberal democracies where we always had problems, but they were secure, and those kind of emerging market democracies, we couldn't really know where they were headed. We're all looking to some degree to be in a similar boat in the social media era that is fomenting growing polarization and intolerance and skepticism about all forms of information and truth. The fifth, which is deeply, deeply concerning me and is the subject of a separate report that I spoke about last night at World Denver, and that was published as a report by the Hoover Institution and the Asia Society last November, called China's Influence and American Interests, is about the surge in power projection and authoritarian ambition of Russia and China, and the impact that's having on the world at the very time that Europe and the United States have more internal problems with their democracies than they've had before, and are more self-absorbed, less self-confident, and less energetic and effective at promoting democracy and democratic values than they were in previous eras, say during the peak of the Cold War and in the immediate post-Cold War period when we were doing very energetic things around the world, but then thought, you know, the Iron Curtain is gone, the Soviet Union is gone, China is kind of still communist in name, but is reforming economically. You know, it's the end of history. We don't need to worry about it anymore. So it's not the end of history. History is back. The sixth dimension to this, I don't think I'm going to get to them all, is the decay of democratic values, which is why I was asking about what's going on in your high school, and of self-confidence in both Europe and the United States. And actually, I can show you, if I get the time, just simply the decay in the quality of democracy as measured by independent ratings institutions in the United States. So I want to stress, I always do as I begin these talks, that it's not just democracy we need to talk about here. You know, democracy is a system where people can choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections. Well, that's all good, but that's not enough. People need freedom. They need freedom of speech, association, the press. They need to be secure in their minority status if they're a vulnerable or marginalized minority. And they need the protection of a vigorous system of rule of law to ensure their individual and minority rights. That's an important element of liberal democracy. And the other important element of liberal democracy is what we call Republican government, not necessarily Republican Party, but the idea of a republic where there's good government, there's a rule of law. The people who govern are governing in the public interest, not in their own personal or narrow group interest, and they are using their power to benefit the public good. And if they cease to do so, they will be discovered, they will be punished, if necessary, removed from office, they'll be exposed. And that requires, obviously, an independent judiciary, a free press, strong institutions of scrutiny in the Congress and elsewhere, and balance of power between the executive branch and other branches of government. So this is what we should want, not only for ourselves, but for the rest of the world. This is what there was progress toward for, a good 2 decades, particularly, I'd say, from the mid-1980s to the kind of mid-aughts, the first decade of the 21st century. And then it just came to a halt, as I will show you. I'm going to skip this, which I think you all know about. And this slide just shows a trend in terms of the percentage of states in the world that are electoral democracies. They meet the minimum condition of being able to choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections. And then the subset of those countries that are liberal democracies, they meet at least a rough test of the higher standard of not only elected government in free and fair elections, but decent control of corruption and decent independence of the courts, decent protection for human rights. And basically, we had the so-called third wave of global democratization begin in the 1970s with the democratization of Spain, Portugal, and Greece, then Latin America in the late 70s and early 80s, then East Asia. And this was very gradual. We went from about 25% of the states in the world, over 1 million population, being democracies at the start of this great period of change in the mid-70s, to about a little over a third, 34, 35%, a decade later. It was a hopeful period of gradual change. And then in 1989, the Big Bang happened, and you see a big jump in this line. And the percentage of democracies in the world went from a little over a third to well over half. And this was the first time in the history of the world that the majority of independent states in the world, and even the majority of independent states over 1 million people, because the smaller states tend to be more democratic, even the somewhat bigger states were 55 at the peak in 2005, about 57% of them democratic. Nothing like this had ever happened before in the history of the world. Now, I am actually not one who believes that all good things have to come to an end. But probably all good things can't keep expanding at this delirious rate indefinitely. So it was, you start running out of countries that were likely candidates for democratization. And it was likely to be the case, I can say, as a social scientist who looks at these statistics a lot, that the rate of democratic improvement would slow down. What I hope for is that as it slowed down, many of the countries that had become electoral democracies but were illiberal democracies, hadn't yet really cemented a rule of law and control of corruption, at least they would improve and move in the liberal direction. Instead, what happened is in 2005, progress of all kinds just came to a screeching halt. And we entered around 2006-07 a period of democratic recession, which is not only still persisting, but is showing signs of acceleration in a number of respects that I've already alluded to with the 6 trends, all of which are deepening. And we've had now 12 years of a trend, which I can show you here with a slide. Here it is, in which more countries have declined in freedom than have gained, as measured annually by Freedom House. So between the end of the Cold War in 1991 and 2005, in the average year, 1.5, 2 times as many, sometimes 2.5 times as many countries would improve their political rights or civil liberties or both, compared to the number of countries that were moving back on one or both of those scales. And in almost every one of those years, the balance was positive. More countries gained than lost ground. Again, in 2006, that just stopped. It was about even. And since then, in every year since, it's been on average about half as many countries gaining in freedom as declining. And what we see is a general downward slide. The liberal democracies, some of them have been becoming less liberal with the rise of authoritarian populism and polarization and intolerance, and in some cases just, really disturbing trends in the rule of law. The countries that were illiberal democracies, but at least robust democracies, some of them have been failing altogether. And we have lost democracy in the first member state of the European Union to defect from democracy since the European Union was established, Hungary. And let me tell you, the Treaty of Lisbon, which is now the governing charter of the European Union, didn't really anticipate this and didn't really make it easy for the European Union to deal with this. And for complicated reasons that I can describe, it has been slow to deal with it. As a result of being slow, I think almost shamefully slow, to deal with the challenge posed by Viktor Orban, who claims proudly to have created a new model of illiberal democracy, but in fact, who has created a model of illiberal non-democracy. Because of their failure to deal with this, you now have democracy slipping back in Poland, challenged in the Czech Republic. I think Slovakia, with their presidential election in the last few weeks, has recently taken a more hopeful turn. But the point is, once you get even a second state, not to mention a third, that's kind of turning in this populist illiberal direction, then they each look out for one another. And the European Union has its famous rules of unanimity. So if you isolate a state and say, okay, we're going to put you on trial now, all the other states need to agree on sanctions. And if one other state says, I object, which Poland certainly does with its current government, then it's, the union is extremely limited in what it can do. And this is a really serious problem now. So more and more democracies, I'll come in a bit to Brazil and the Philippines. Peru, the recent former president of Peru has just been placed in 3 years of preventive detention because of corruption charges. Now that raises two rule of law issues. One is the allegations of corruption under the Odebrecht scandal, or what's called in Brazil the Lava Jato scandal, which has completely discredited the political class in both Brazil and Peru and a number of other Latin American countries. But it also raises the rule of law question, well, preventive detention for 3 years for a former president with no judicial hearing and no chance to prove his innocence? I mean, that isn't the rule of law either. In any case, that's a second class of countries that's deteriorating. The third class of countries is the category of regime below electoral democracies. And those are the regimes that are authoritarian, but they at least have some elements of pluralism. They allow some opposition in parliament, in civil society, in the press, and so on. And these leaders of what we call competitive authoritarian regimes now judge the heat is off. Europe doesn't care anymore. The United States doesn't seem to care at all. The Japanese have always been reluctant to put political conditions on their relations with other countries, and China could care less. So they feel, great, we are now emboldened, we can do whatever they want, and whatever we want, we the authoritarian rulers. As a result, in Cambodia, Hun Sen, a really nasty, murderous, kleptocratic, thuggish ruler. When the session is over, I'll tell you what I really think of him. You know, he said, why should I tolerate opposition members in parliament if I don't need to? And in the last election, he didn't. And Hun Sen's ruling party now has every seat in parliament. And I'll tell you what happened in Uganda in a minute. And then the, the authoritarian states of the world, China, Russia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, they're becoming more and more repressive and more technologically sophisticated and comprehensive in their repression. So what we see is a noose that's put around the neck of a pluralistic but maybe imperfect democracy by an ambitious ruler who begins to sniff opportunity, weakness and division in the opposition, apathy and division among the established democracies, encouragement and opportunity from China and Russia, and then they start tightening the noose. First, they demonize and delegitimize the political opposition as treasonous. Then they go after independent media. Yeah, thank you. I actually brought a small armada of just those things. But I haven't learned how to talk with a cough drop in my mouth, so let me try and get through this. The only good thing I can say is I know I'm not contagious anymore. It's now kind of into the asthma phase of the situation. In any case, they go after the independence of the media and grind it down and pull away independent media from criticizing them, force opposition media to sell and threaten them with tax liability or prosecution if they don't. They go after the courts, as Duterte has done in the Philippines, as Orban has done in Hungary, as Erdogan has done in Turkey, and they remove constitutional court judges who don't agree with them. They put in cronies and loyalists to literally pack the court so that there's going to be no check or resistance from the judiciary. And they just start going down the list of what could constrain their power. I have what I call the autocrat's 12-step program. If you look at what has been happening in Turkey, in Hungary, in Poland, in the Philippines now, what I fear that Brazil's new president, Jair Bolsonaro, has ambitions to do, it looks like it's written on a postcard and that's kind of, crossing borders, and one leader passes it on to the other, and they just follow the program. But you don't need to have someone give you this agenda in order to, if you're a diabolical and methodical autocrat who wants to be careful to suffocate democracy while leaving no fingerprints, you don't need to have someone else write the agenda. You can kind of figure it out. And so how much it's being borrowed and how much it's being reinvented by one wily autocrat after another, I don't know. But from compromising the independence of the media and getting their business cronies to buy up all the independent media, so there's really no criticism of the president and the ruling party, you then go on to gain control of public broadcasting. You constrain the freedom of the internet. You start intimidating independence of non-governmental organizations, universities, think tanks, and other actors in civil society. You say to business, look, are you for us or are you against us? If you're going to keep funding the opposition parties, let's see here, we have your tax returns from 2014, and it looks like you hid a lot of income from your corporation or whatever. And they know it doesn't matter whether they did or not, they're going to jail. Whatever the evidence is, once the autocrat has gained control of the judiciary, any outcome can be achieved. And so it's the old saying from the Brazilian dictator of the 1930s and 40s, Getúlio Vargas, for my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law. And the law is used not in a rule of law sense, but in a perverse way to just level the field from criticism, dissent, resistance, significant political pluralism, until finally the only thing that's left is the electoral process itself. Now, if you don't have independent media, if you don't have wealthy people able to contribute financially to opposition campaigns, you're probably not going to win, right? But why take any chances? So Orban gerrymandered electoral districts, took control of the electoral administration, and was able to return his party to power in the last election with a very comfortable majority, even though he got, a lot of people don't pay attention to this kind of detail, a minority of the vote. But if you jigger the rules well enough, a minority could be good enough to retain a lockhold on power. So when you're done with all of this, steps 1 through 11, You just repeat them again. That's step number 12. And this is what these rulers have been doing until gradually, it's hard to know when it happened in Russia, hard to know when it happened in the early years of Putin, hard to know when it happened in the early years of Chavez in Venezuela, hard to know when it happened after Daniel Ortega came back to power in Nicaragua about 14 years ago. But in each case, I can tell you, it happened a lot sooner than most of the world was willing to recognize. And then you get this kind of guy who's still in power 15 years later, who, when in the last midterm election, people complained about his corruption and so on, and then his party was returned to power in the local elections. He said, look, you know, you're going to criticize me, you're going to criticize my party. People who lied about us, I'm paraphrasing the quote, you can read here if you can see it. People who lied about us and who stole state secrets, you're not going to get away with us. We will walk into your den. We will find you. And those who have defamed us today have been hit with a full Ottoman slap by the nation. That's the way he talks, that's the way he thinks, that's the way an authoritarian populist rallies his base. I told you about Uganda, which was a competitive authoritarian regime, and now it's moving toward just being an authoritarian regime. The ruler, Yoweri Museveni, was not content to leave after 34 years in power, even though the Constitution had an age limit that he had passed. The opposition was bravely standing up in Parliament to oppose this legal constitutional change, which was not popular with the Ugandan people. That is the change. And Museveni sends troops onto the floor of Parliament. They physically beat on the floor of Parliament the opposition members, send many of them to the hospital. And then my friend, who's an opposition civil society leader, writes me and says, it appears the whole region, East Africa, really Africa, is in a steep democratic recession, partly because of the loud silence from the West. And by the way, this is what I hear all over the world from democratic journalists, civil society leaders, and opposition politicians, how important the voice and the stance of the United States and other powerful liberal democracies, Australia, in Asia, the European Union and its individual members, of course, how important these voices are. In the past, the state was a little reluctant to be this brute and violent and had some measure of shame. It is all gone. And that is the kind of world, if you look at Egypt under al-Sisi, if you look at Saudi Arabia murdering this journalist who I knew and had brought to Stanford, Jamal Khashoggi, and you name it. This is you look at what the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang province, where 1 to 2 million Uyghurs are in concentration camps. This is the way the world is going now. The escalating pace of democratic breakdown is being fed by the fact that these regimes weren't that strong in the first place. They had a weak rule of law, that wily autocrats knew how to dismantle if they thought they could get away with it. So when the opposition is divided, when they win a big enough temporary victory, and when the West is distracted or complicit or loses its backbone, they decide to turn a temporary victory into a permanent one. And then the leading step is to enlarge executive power, remove constitutional constraints, play on the polarization in the society to mobilize their intense base. It's facilitated by other weak political institutions, parties, parliament, maybe by the fact that economic performance had not been good, corruption had been rife, people grow cynical, and then the world appears to be turning. It's a kind of, you can't really touch it, but you can feel it. There's a word for it. The Germans have a great word for it. It's called Zeitgeist. Has anybody heard that word before? It meant a lot in the 1930s. It means the spirit of the times, okay? The spirit of the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s was a spirit of democracy and liberal values. And that spirit now is turning, imploding in an authoritarian direction, in an illiberal direction, in these ill winds that I've been writing about in this book. And so if we don't have a strategy for turning that around, it's going to be a really, really dangerous and depressing period ahead for Americans, not just because this is not the kind of world we want to live in, but if you think about who our enemies are, or at least adversaries, countries like North Korea, Iran, Cuba, which is a major factor now in propping up this incredibly corrupt and decadent regime in Venezuela, not to mention Russia and China. Any country that really threatens the core national interests of the United States today and in the past is a non-democracy. And there's never been a war between two real democracies. So if we could create a world of more democracies, we would have a world that's much more in the national interest. I don't really have the time to get into this section of the book about illiberal populism, but populism shares a set of key dimensions. It's anti-elitist, it's anti-pluralism, it thinks everybody should really believe one way. It's really contemptuous of institutions. It's got hegemonic tendencies to really say our movement, our party, this leader is the only legitimate alternative, the only legitimate true representative of the real people. It's plebiscitary, that is, it wants direct democracy over representative democracy, and has contempt for parliament and lifts up the leader. And then the illiberal element is that it's intolerant of minorities and often hyper-nationalist as well. So fortunately, Jacob Zuma has been driven from power in South Africa. Keiko Fujimori was stymied in her bid to have her corrupt family, the Fujimoris, come back to power in Peru. But you still got Viktor Orban there, and Duterte has gone very far towards strangling democracy in the Philippines. The most famous opposition journalist and anti-corruption activist in the Philippines, who you might have seen on CNN years ago when she was a correspondent in Asia, Maria Ressa, who now leads an online movement and newspaper trying to do investigative journalism. She's got a new set of charges against her. Duterte is going to try and send her to jail. He has already forced, as I said, the Constitutional Court Chief Justice off the bench. He's arrested his leading opponent in the Senate and sent her to jail. Interesting, all of these counterweights to Duterte are women. And he has presided over the extrajudicial killing of at least 12,000 people since he came to power in May of 2016. Democracy in the Philippines, which people struggled so hard for and risked so much for in 1986, is really hanging by a thread now. And where's the voice of the United States on this? I'm sorry to say, I don't say this as a partisan statement, but the President of the United States has had a very warm relationship with Duterte and has been very indulgent of this kind of behavior. And of course, I've referred to Poland, Jaroslaw Kaczynski and the Law and Justice Party, Marine Le Pen in France. There's a lot of nasty stuff. And you look on the left and you see left-wing alternatives as well that are rising in Europe. The political party Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, who's thrown in his lot, Prime Minister Tsipras, with the Chinese and the Russians, and really given the Chinese the most important port in Greece now. It's really, really alarming. And this character in Mongolia, which I'll skip, this is Babiš, the new prime minister in the Czech Republic, who's been accused of widespread corruption and is an anti-EU, anti-immigrant personality, and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who has made such memorable statements as, I am in favor of torture, you know that, and the people are in favor too. Through the vote, you will not change anything in this country. I guess he has a different attitude now that he's been elected president. Absolutely nothing. Things will change, unfortunately, the day we start a civil war in here and doing the work that the military regime did not do, killing about 30,000 people. This is the new president of Brazil. I spoke about social media. Unfortunately, I don't have time to, detail what is a long chapter of my book. But the problem is we used to live in a common media sphere. We used to share some base of information about the world. And, people did not believe that Walter Cronkite was lying when he reported the news. And, we're all, I think, of a similar, or most of us of a similar generation here. So I think the majority of people in this room remember that what I remember, that when Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam and produced that special about how badly the Vietnam War was going, and Lyndon Johnson saw it, he said, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the country. Well, we have no such common base of information and understanding now. We're fragmented into competing media spheres. It's been brewing for a long time in the cable television age. It's worse now in the social media sphere, where we get encapsulated in these information bubbles. And we are not interacting sufficiently across political and social perspectives, which is why I think encouraging this in the high schools and lower schools, where people are naturally coming together, with differences, is good. We need to get people to appreciate and value difference, and to be able to talk about their different points of view without feeling that the other side is evil or unacceptable. In the social media age, outrageous and extreme comments go viral very quickly. And we actually have social science studies that show that fake news travels further, has more impact, and is remembered more than the real thing. And it is really, if you think about it, the same reason that the National Enquirer sells more copies than the New York Times. It's more titillating, it's more shocking, and people like entertainment and shock value, and the truth can be boring. So, how we overcome this, I don't know, but it's now all the problems we have had with these divisions on steroids. And then we have the problem, on which I'll close, of the authoritarian power surge, which is a major theme in my book and in this report we did on China. It's not just that Europe and the United States are mired in their divisions and their anxieties about immigration and all the other things that divide them culturally and so on. And in some ways, retreating from the world. It's also that Russia and China have been rising, or in the case of Russia, resurging very rapidly. And the rate of Chinese military expansion alone has been phenomenal. And when you combine that with their technological surge, again, a lot of it as a result of Chinese theft or forced transfer of American high technology, much of it dual-use technology, navigation systems, drone technology, artificial intelligence, supercomputing. These have wonderful commercial and life-enhancing applications. They've also got really, really scary military applications. And if you want to see a really vivid demonstration of this, read the novel by one of the leading American experts on military technology, the novel by Peter Singer called Ghost Fleet. I read this novel a couple years ago, and then I read the report by the Defense Innovation Unit, experimental, in draft form. It finally came out in December 2017, China's Technology Transfer Strategy. And, I realized something incredibly frightening, that, we could be 10 years away from China having, at least in Asia, military superiority over the United States. And a lot of it would be unconventional and asymmetrical because of this high technology stuff. So, then you look at what Russia's been doing, also asymmetrical, to intervene in our elections and our social media and manipulate and inflame passions, and what China and Russia have been doing to pose a new form of sharp power that is not trying to persuade and win people over through their values, but that is using corruption, coercion, and untruth, deception, to try to create a whole narrative that is apart from reality and really discrediting us and uplifting them and pulling people away from us in the world and facilitating all of these autocrats who are doing the things they're doing while weakening our democracies. This is a lot of what we document with Chinese penetration and subversion of universities, think tanks, Chinese language media, local politics, particularly in Australia, and many other sectors. So we've got a lot of work to do to strengthen and improve the resilience of our democracy. And we have a lot of work to do, I think, again, to promote in the best sense of the word, not through force, not through coercion, but through the quiet work of our diplomacy, of our cultural exchanges, of grants to civil society organizations and independent media, to support Democrats around the world and stand behind free flows of information and democratic norms and values. And the people, many of whom we do bring to the US, and I know who come to Colorado as well, who are waging this battle on the ground and who used to have a lot more high-level support from the United States than they do today. I really think we're in a period now when you look at our decay and Russia and China's resurgence and this vulnerable moment that we're at, what I call a possible hinge in world history, where we could turn this back in a better direction. And I think we could turn this back, because one of the things I study is attitudes and values toward democracy around the world. And I know that around the world, even in Africa, I would almost say especially in Africa, among very poor people and people with very low levels of education, people know the price that they pay if they do not have the protection of a rule of law, a constitution, and elections in which they can turn out bad and abusive rulers. They want democracy, they want freedom of the press, they want freedom of association, they want a rule of law, and I think it's not only in our, obviously, genetic makeup as a people, normatively, but also profoundly in our national interest to help them get it. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. What's the role of climate change in speeding all of this up?
I think it's largely prospective in the future. But the future is really scary. And let me tell you why. We're on the edge, as you know, I don't think you would have asked the question if you didn't know, of massive displacement of human societies. I mean, there are countries, island states in the Pacific for sure, that are going to disappear. Where are those people going to go? You have agricultural patterns being disrupted in Africa, looming water shortages. My friend Tom Friedman has been writing about this in the Middle East. You think Europe is facing a crisis of immigration now from the Middle East and Africa? It's just nothing compared to what they're going to be facing in the future if, A, we don't do more to arrest climate change and really fund and support climate adaptation. B, we don't slow population growth in Africa because population growth is going to dramatically accelerate the effects of climate change. It's going to accelerate deforestation, remove more water, and just, there is a basic concept in biology, human biology, called carrying capacity. And these fragile ecosystems, they can accommodate more people with planning, but can they accommodate 400 million Nigerians, 200 million Ethiopians, 100 million Ugandans, over 100 million Kenyans? I mean, we're talking about staggering potential numbers within 30 or 40 years. And at the same time, by the way, Europe's population is imploding. And then finally, we've got to have better governance in Africa, in Central America, and elsewhere in affected areas, or we're not going to be able to slow population growth, enhance economic development, and do it in a way that can improve adaptation to climate change and the mitigation of its ill effects. But none of that is to contradict or fail to appreciate the most important point, which is we must slow climate change itself. I mean, radically. This is the single most important existential challenge facing human civilization. I'm sorry I'm not lecturing on it. In a way, I feel guilty about it, but it's just not my area of expertise, and so I've got to lecture and write about what I know something about.
Yeah, Mr. Diamond, thank you very much. I commend you for your extremely important work, which is paramount.
Oh, thank you.
In today's world, because civil society, American civil society in particular, will continue to NED and so forth. So thank you very much. Okay, I have a question about an election that's occurring today in a country that you did not mention, probably because it is not yet a failed democracy, talking about Indonesia. Today, as we speak, they're voting right now, and if the president of the country is defeated by Prabowo, indicted by the United Nations for crimes against humanity for the massacres that he led in East Timor, I won't go any further. I'd just like your comment on, it's unlikely to happen, but it could happen because it's a dirty election. What's your comment on what the repercussions that would be for the world's third largest democracy and largest Muslim country in the world? Thank you.
So, Indonesia, there's an election today. A few points. Thanks for the question. Number one, I'm told by my colleagues who are Indonesia experts that fortunately it looks like the incumbent president, Joko Widodo, is going to be comfortably reelected. But maybe you will be right, and money and corruption will change that outcome. Secondly, we got to remember Prabowo came very close to winning last time. Third, if it should happen and Prabowo should win this time, you know, I know what I would do, and that is keep him at a very great distance and heavily condition future aid and investment on respect for human rights. The problem is that autocrats like this feel now that they've got another option. And if the US is going to lean on them, they'll just turn to China, and China won't care. And the fourth point to make, which I think is instructive here, is that keep in mind that the current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, who is also running for re-election in the staggered elections that India holds over several weeks this spring, was also believed to be complicit in crimes against humanity in the Gujarat massacre of Muslims some years ago when he was chief minister, and was banned from travel to the United States because of that. And he got elected prime minister, and I mean, let's be honest here, this happened under Barack Obama, not under Donald Trump. The United States government said, and in a way, I do understand it, what can we do? He's the prime minister of the largest, not the third largest, democracy in the world. I think, you know, we've got to have correct relations with leaders of other states, and even more correct relations with leaders of other democracies. But the problem is when we go silent about our values, we go silent about our norms, we look the other way, and we then send the message, which again was the subject of a Tom Friedman column that I highly recommend to you. We say, as the old song said, Cole Porter song, anything goes. Anything goes, do whatever you want. And that's what's really dangerous. So there are different ways to have correct relations. You're a diplomat, right? I think you know the distinction. There are different ways to have correct relations. And you can have correct relations and still be pretty candid about what your values are, what your concerns are, and where you stand as a country.
Next question's up there.
Mr. Diamond, zooming back out here to big picture, how much of a catalyst for the backslide of democracy that your charts, indicated began around 2005, 2006 can be traced back to 9/11 and the destabilization of the Middle East?
I would say a significant amount, but the effect was indirect. The catalytic factor, in my view, was the response to 9/11 by the George W. Bush administration, not the response of invading Afghanistan. That was going to happen. There was no way that Osama bin Laden was going to take down those towers and we weren't going to go after him. I think that probably at the time, 90% of the American public supported the American military intervention in Afghanistan to dislodge him from Afghanistan and to get rid of the regime that allowed it to happen. Iraq was different. It was a war of choice. And I'm not going to relitigate that war, But I am going to say that when we did not find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, for which we know, in retrospect, there was no convincing evidence, there was only suspicion and manufactured intelligence. When we did not find that evidence, the only other way to legitimize the American intervention to the American people and to the world was to say, we are here in Iraq to build a democracy, and that part of our mission was, which was actually part of the motive some people had for intervening, to displace an odious and dangerous dictatorship and replace it with a democracy. When this military intervention came to be identified with democracy promotion, it turned many people in the United States and in Europe against democracy promotion and soured them on the whole concept of robust engagement in the world for ethical purposes as kind of dangerous, arrogant, and bound to go wrong. And it led to, you know, whenever we have a bad turn in world affairs or foreign policy, we always overcorrect. And so we had Nixon and Johnson and the Vietnam War, and then we got Carter. And frankly, in my view, he overcorrected. And we got, you know, the Ayatollahs and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and a lot of bad stuff. Then we got Reagan, and he revived American strength in the world. But I think he overcorrected in Central America, and we got the Iran-Contra crisis. And then, you know, George W. Bush overcorrected for what he thought was the multilateralism of the Clinton administration, and said, you know, particularly Cheney and Rumsfeld, the hell with everybody, you know, we're just going to do what's in the American interest. And then we paid a price for that. And then Obama came in, bless his heart, I think he did many good things. I think he cared about human rights, but he was very, very cautious and very reluctant to use force. He did it, again, finally, to get rid of Osama bin Laden. He did it in Libya. I know he regrets that now. But, you know, he refused to do it in Syria. And some people think he pulled back too much and created spaces that Russia and China could rush into. So I think there was a big knock-on effect.
Next question's over here.
Okay.
You talk about recession in the world, in democracy, recession, and it reminds me of economics and the old saying that when your neighbor loses his job, that's a recession, but when you lose your job, it's a depression.
Right.
And you really haven't talked very much. It's them, the other countries. You really haven't talked much about the United States and where we stand on the democracy scale today. And I noticed your list of 12 different attributes of authoritarian regimes. And are we just, at this point, are we just missing in action, or do we have bigger problems to face here at home?
Well, that was the kind of question that got me into trouble in Colorado Springs. And specifically, I was asked by a young woman, well, I looked at that 12-step program, and many of those steps look awfully familiar here in the United States. That was her comment. And I said to her what I'll say to you now. I try very hard to not be partisan in talks like this, particularly to World Affairs Councils. And I think that there are problems. First of all, a lot of people have that reaction to that 12-step program. So obviously, there's something going on with the presidential conduct of the current president that is leading people to see a lot of familiarity here, in language at least, that's used about opposition, about the press, and so on. I can only say that I'm obviously holding back a lot here because of the stance I want to strike. But in this book, Ill Winds, which is coming out on June 11th, and you can pre-order on Amazon, I don't hold back at all. And a very blunt answer to your question to the second part of your question is in that book. Now let me come to the first part of your question, which is actually at the end of the slides, but I think the projector's turned off now. Freedom House has a 0 to 100 scale that measures the quality of democracy around the world. Every year, they started releasing this more detailed data around 2005. So we can track from 2005 to the present the trends in the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Japan, Sweden, etc., of the US and its democratic advanced industrial peers on this 0 to 100 scale. And The Economist magazine does something similar every year in their annual democracy index. I think The Economist magazine rates about 160 countries in the world. And they have a dividing line between about the top 30 democracies, which they call full democracies, and then another 50 or so that they call flawed democracies. You know where the US is now in the Economist magazine scale? Well, it's fallen into the flawed democracies category, and it's now kind of ranks behind Uruguay and Costa Rica. In the Freedom House scale, you could see the United States starting to fall around 2013, 2014, from around 93, and then it fell by the end of 2017 to 86, where it still is now, and that puts it behind every other advanced democracy of the world, in terms of our advanced industrial democratic peers. And, you may like Trump, you may worry about Trump. You may feel more negative about Trump than worrying about him. But the problems are not all Trump. It's severe political polarization. It is a dysfunctional Congress. It's a take-no-prisoners attitude toward politics in general. It's now, we're seeing on the Democratic side, I more or less considered this inevitable, the radicalization that we saw with the Tea Party on the Republican side. And I think, and we know, we have evidence to show that more and more people feel that the choices that they're being given in November do not represent them, do not give them an option that's maybe somewhere in the middle, or that is at least different than the options they're being given. My view is it is the central theme of my chapter about how to fix American democracy. Since you asked, I will tell you this. It is not a partisan statement that I'm going to make. I think our democratic system is deeply broken. I think the incentives of electing our Congress, and I will say our state legislatures, by the method of nominating the two-party candidates who almost always, 99.9% of the time, are one of the two, that will get elected. The method of nominating them in low turnout primary elections, where generally the more ideologically motivated disproportionately turn out to vote, and then having them face in November is a deeply broken model, but it is one that generates incentives for the legislators and for many governors, but the problem is worse with the legislators, to govern from the margins rather than from the incentive, because that's what's going to get them renominated. And you know what? You can't get elected unless you're nominated by a political party. There's very few people these days who get elected as independents. So I don't want to eliminate the party system or even the two-party system. I just want to juice it up a bit and make it more democratic. And I want to give independents a fair shot, and I want to give voters more choice, and I want more competition, and I want to remove these perverse incentives to appeal to the base and eschew compromise, eschew moderation, even when you know, and many members of Congress know, it's the right thing to do. They are failing to act in many cases, I won't say all, they're failing to act in many cases, not because they're bad people, not because they're extreme people, but because they are responding to the incentive structure of our democracy. I personally believe it's a conclusion I came to many years ago. A growing number of political scientists and reformers are coming to this conclusion, and foundations that are putting real money into this, that the only way to fix this is with ranked choice voting, in which voters rank their choices 1, 2, 3, 4, and if no one gets a majority of the vote on the first round, then the votes of the lowest placing candidates, the second place votes are transferred to the remaining candidates, and you keep getting that instant runoff until somebody emerges with a majority of the vote and wins. If we had that system in the United States, I think we would start seeing two things. Well, you also need to do another thing, which is get rid of the sore loser rule, which prevents anyone from contesting as an independent in a general election if they lose a party primary, which I also think is deeply undemocratic. If you do those two things, and you're an incumbent senator or congressman, and you say, I think this is the right thing to do, you've got another path now. You can say to yourself, well, maybe I'll lose a party primary. The heck with it. I'll come back and run as an independent in the general election. I'll appeal to the center of the country. I already have some base of respect. I have a hunch there will be a lot of people in the state who will be grateful to me for trying to strike compromises to make the country governable again. And I think you'd see a lot more courage on Capitol Hill, because suddenly courage would pay off. We can't ask our politicians to commit political suicide, and that's what the current system does. And if you really feel that way, I'd like to tell you, I have a hunch that there's going to be a push in Colorado for ranked choice voting. Maine was the first state to adopt it in 2018, and it actually made a difference in a congressional election. So if this interests you, look around for what people are saying here.
We have a question here.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and quickly, I think it was Reagan who said in the 80s about being a beacon for democracies. If not us, who? If not now, when?
Yeah.
And that was one of the things he said. But what I was saying, it sounds a little bleak, but what we have above all these other countries in poker, we have a constitutional republic that guarantees us majority rule with rights to the minority, and we have the First, Second, Fourth, Sixth Amendment that gives us the rights above all other countries for individuals like to assemble here, liberty, and that is key to what is what's so unique about America, and that is what makes us a beacon on the cliff. That's just my
Well,
feeling
I mean, I think that was very eloquently stated, and, I would just endorse it in two respects. First of all, there's no president of the post-World War II era that did more to entrench democracy promotion as a foundation of American foreign policy than Ronald Reagan. And it was a result of, it was because of his famous 1982 speech, June 82, to the Parliament at Westminster in London, that the National Endowment for Democracy, which is our lead institution for promoting democracy, was launched. That was when the idea was floated. And secondly, everything else you said is true, and that's why we want to be encouraging and promoting liberal values, the kinds of freedoms that you referred to, and not just voting every 4 years.
Next question.
California has adopted an open primary system. Do you think that could also lead to moderation in candidates like your rank order voting?
I'm not a fan of what California did. And I'll give you two reasons why. So California created something called a blanket primary. Washington State already has it. We eliminated partisan primaries, and we just said the first round will be in our primary in June for all state offices, and then legislature and Congress and so on. And then the top two candidates, Republican or Democrat, will face off against one another in November. Now, it's got some good aspects, because if you're in an overwhelmingly Democratic district, the idea was if you had one Democrat who's more to the left and one who's more moderate, the latter might get some Democratic votes and most of the Republican votes, and then win, and you'd get a tendency toward moderation. As a general rule, it hasn't worked out that way. One reason why, I think the main reason why, is you are still nominating people in low turnout primaries. And generally, it's still the more ideologically committed who are turning out. And so not only the first one, but the first two past the post, they may not really differ that much. Or you might wind up getting, a fairly left Democrat and a fairly left Republican. Or you might get a perverse situation where you've got a substantially Democratic district, but you've got 15 Democrats running in an open seat and 2 Republicans, and you might wind up in a general election with the 2 Republicans facing one another because the Democrats fragmented their votes so much. That almost happened in 1 or 2 congressional districts in California. And because voter turnout is so low in primaries, I think it narrows the field too radically. So what people are talking about now is something called top 4. You take the top 4 candidates, highly likely to get more pluralism, more variety, you advance them to the general election, and then you use ranked choice voting to pick the winner. And I think that's a reform that's going to gain momentum in California.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's fantastic. You have not said anything about Israel, and you have not said, with the new president, where do
Prime Minister?
Yeah, the new prime minister. Where do they fit in this scale of democracy, in the 2 scales that you think, and where will you think it move now with the new prime minister?
Well, of course, he's not new. He's been there 10 years. The re-elected one. Let me say, I knew I wasn't going to get out of this room without talking about Donald Trump. I almost made it on Bibi Netanyahu. It's a real shame I didn't quite get there. I'm Jewish. I've spent a lot of time in Israel. I deeply identify with Israel. I took 12 Stanford students to Israel for 3 weeks in 2016. Some of them pretty darn critical in their views. And I think I got them to see Israel in a more complex and holistic sense. And they came away, maybe in a few instances, not free of criticism, but with a much more nuanced appreciation for many of the extraordinary features of Israeli democracy and Israeli society and pluralism and whatnot. So I say what I am going to say with a heavy heart. I think that you simply cannot be a scholar of democracy or someone who works on, quantitative measurements of democracy and not see the decline of liberal democracy in Israel during these 10 years of Bibi Netanyahu's rule. The politicization of institutions, the demonization of opponents. I mean, you can a little bit, come back to those 12 points. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that Israel is not still a democracy. It is. But it is a less liberal democracy and a less high-quality democracy than it has been. And it took a step in a further illiberal direction when it passed this nationality bill, making its own Arab citizens second-class citizens, in essence, which undercut one of the main arguments I had been using to try to, deflect the BDS movement on the US campus and elsewhere. Now, I have more complex views about Jerusalem. My feeling, I wasn't quite outraged about it as I've been, the movement of our embassy, as I've been about other things, just because, Jerusalem is Israel's capital. My complaint about it was that this was important to Israel. I think the US could have gotten something in exchange from Israel for it, and we didn't even try and do it. But my deep, deep worry now is that if Prime Minister Netanyahu does proceed, as he pledged to do in the campaign, as he reached out to an extreme far-right party, which any coalition with in even a recent previous era would have been unthinkable. If he really does proceed to annex a piece of the West Bank, and it won't stop there. It'll be one, and then it'll be another, and then it'll be another. We will soon be in a situation where I will no longer be able to say to Stanford students or students elsewhere who are calling for BDS, this has no similarity whatsoever to apartheid in South Africa. We warned when we, a group of American and Israeli scholars, were engaged in a series of discussions 29 years ago that led to the birth of the Israel Democracy Institute. We could see this train coming from a distance, a long distance down the track. And we said then the words that Obama would say later: Israel cannot be democratic and a Jewish state and greater Israel. You cannot have all three. It's logically impossible. And so I don't, as a Jewish American, I don't want to see Israel cease to be a Jewish state. I do not favor a single state, and I do not think a single state can work among Israelis and Palestinians. And I certainly do not want to see Israel cease to be a democracy. because I think that would be the moral death of Israel. And, you know, it would just be then another great power struggling for preeminence. And so it's got to give up the greater Israel fantasy. The notion that they could annex the West Bank or significant pieces of it, drive the Palestinians permanently from this territory, and get away with it. I'll just say, this is not sustainable. It's morally wrong. And once Israel has done that, then to have those Palestinians living in this, you know, chopped up space that's no longer feasible as an independent state, I think you've basically got a situation that looks increasingly like the Bantustan states that South Africa had created around itself. And the world, you know, Israel's on a roll now with technology. The Arab states have sold out their Palestinian brethren. No Arab state is making much of fuss of this. But that's for now. I think public opinion is turning. I can see it among young people in the United States and Europe. I see it and I fear it. If Israel ceases to be a democracy, and it looks like just another powerful country that says what Netanyahu is in essence saying, might makes right, I think it will lose ultimately not only its democracy, but one of its most precious assets.
Thank you.